Kang Min-jae was stepping through the crowded plaza, his security detail clearing a path like a tidal wave, when the world suddenly went quiet. He felt a small, trembling hand tugging at his suit jacket. His men reacted instantly, hands reaching for holstered weapons, but they froze when they saw the intruder. It wasn't an assassin. It was a girl, no older than 6, wearing a faded pink t-shirt and eyes filled with a terror so deep it stopped the most dangerous man in Seoul in his tracks. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Instead, her small hands began to move in a frantic, blurred dance of sign language. Min-jae watched, confused, until he saw the one sign his mother had taught him a lifetime ago, snake. He followed her gaze. Just behind him, a man in a blue jacket was calmly reaching into his pocket, his eyes locked on the back of Min-jae's head. Min-jae didn't call for his guards. He didn't pull his gun. Instead, he dropped to one knee, putting himself at eye level with the child, using his broad shoulders to shield her from the crowd. As the shadow of the man in the blue jacket loomed closer, Min-jae realized this little girl wasn't just a witness, she was a warning sent from a world he thought he'd long since left behind. "Who sent you, Era?" he whispered, reading her name off a small bracelet. Her hands shook as she signed the final, devastating truth: "They are coming for us both. Stay with me until the end," because the secret this silent girl shared next didn't just save Min-jae's life, it forced a Mafia boss to wage a war for the only person who dared to tell him the truth without saying a single word. The sun was beginning to dip behind the jagged skyline of Seoul, casting long, predatory shadows across the crowded plaza. Kang Min-jae walked with a rhythmic, heavy stride, his face a mask of indifference that acted as a shield against the world. His security detail moved like a well-oiled machine, pushing through the throngs of commuters and tourists. They were halfway to the waiting motorcade when the perimeter was breached. A small, frantic figure darted through the gap between two bodyguards. Min-jae felt a sharp tug on his sleeve, a touch so light it was almost a ghost of a sensation. His lead guard moved instinctively, a hand already reaching for the concealed weapon beneath his coat, but Min-jae raised a single finger. He looked down and saw her, a girl in a dusty pink shirt, her eyes wide with a terror that surpassed the fear of the armed men surrounding her. She didn't speak. Instead, her hands flew into the air, moving with a desperate, jerky speed. The guard saw a nuisance, but Min-jae saw something else. He saw the way she looked past him, her eyes fixed on the man in the blue jacket who was trailing 20 paces behind. He saw her hands form a shape, a sharp, striking motion of a snake's head. Min-jae didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee, pulling the girl into the curve of his body just as a muffled thud cracked the air. A bullet shattered the glass of a storefront inches from where his head had been a second before. The plaza erupted into a vacuum of panicked screams. Min-jae's men swarmed, but his world had narrowed down to the child trembling in his arms. He looked into Era's eyes, seeing his own dark reflection mirrored in her tears. She had no voice, yet she had screamed louder than any siren. "Why did you do it?" he whispered, the chaos of the hit fading into a dull roar in the background. Era didn't answer with words, she simply pointed toward the shadows where the man in the blue jacket had vanished. In that moment, the ghost of Seoul realized his life had been saved by the one thing he never thought existed, a heart that didn't want anything in return. The armored sedan tore away from the plaza, tires screaming against the asphalt as Min-jae's security detail formed a protective cocoon around the vehicle. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Min-jae sat in the darkened back seat, his adrenaline still surging, looking down at the small girl huddled against the door. Era was trembling so violently that her teeth chattered, her small hands tucked tightly into the sleeves of her pink shirt. Min-jae felt a jagged, unfamiliar sensation in his chest, frustration mixed with a burgeoning debt. He was a man who balanced books with blood, and right now, his ledger showed he owed this child his life. He leaned forward, his shadow looming over her. "Who sent you?" he demanded, his voice like grinding stones. "How did you know he was there?" Era looked up, her tear-filled eyes searching his face. Her lips parted, but only a soft, hushing sound escaped. Her hands flew out, fingers dancing in a complex, desperate rhythm, but to Min-jae, it was a foreign code he couldn't crack. He watched her frantic gestures, a point to the window, a mimicry of a gun, a sign over her heart, but the more she tried to explain, the more his anger at the communication barrier grew. He slammed his palm against the leather armrest, making the girl flinch. "Stop," he growled, not at her, but at the silence. He looked at his driver through the rearview mirror. "Take us to the warehouse at the docks. Lock the perimeter. And call Sang-ho. Tell him I need a translator. Not one of our usual street thugs. I want someone who knows sign language and knows how to keep their tongue behind their teeth." The car arrived at a nondescript, rusted building by the water, a place where Min-jae usually brought people who were never meant to be seen again. Now, it served a different purpose, a sanctuary. He stepped out, then reached back in, hesitating for a second before offering his hand to the girl. Era stared at his scarred palm, a hand that had ended lives, and slowly placed her tiny, cold fingers in his. Inside the dim, concrete room, a young woman was already waiting, trembling under the gaze of Min-jae's armed guards. "She's mute," Min-jae stated, pacing the floor like a caged predator as he pointed to Era. "She saved my life today by telling me something I couldn't hear. I need to know what else she knows. Translate everything, or neither of you leaves this room." He sat on the edge of a wooden table, his intense eyes fixed on Era's hands, waiting for the silence to finally be broken. The dim yellow light of the warehouse office flickered as the translator's hands began to mirror Era's. The air grew heavy, the only sound being the distant slap of harbor waves against the concrete. Min-jae stood perfectly still, his silhouette looming large against the wall, his eyes never leaving the girl's small, frantic fingers. "She was at the playground," the translator whispered, her voice trembling as she deciphered the signs. "The one near the Han River, hidden by the construction zone. She went there to find her cat, hiding in the colorful plastic tunnel where the adults never look." Era's movements became more rigid, her face contorting with a memory that was far too heavy for a child. She signed a sequence of numbers and then pointed to her own eyes, then to a man's height. "She saw them," the translator continued, swallowing hard. "Your inner circle. She says 3 men met there at dawn, thinking the rain and the abandoned park would keep them invisible. She recognized the man in the blue jacket, the one who tried to kill you today. But he wasn't the one leading. She saw him bowing to someone else. Someone she calls, the man with the red ring." Min-jae's blood turned to ice. Only one man in his organization wore a ring of deep Burmese ruby, his second in command, a man he had treated like a brother for 20 years. They were laughing, the translator said, her hands slowing as the weight of the betrayal sank in. They had a map spread out on the slide. They were pointing at the plaza, marking the exact spot where your car would stop. They said once the ghost was buried, the city would finally be theirs to burn. But then. The translator paused, looking at Era with a sudden, sharp fear. Era signed a final, slow motion, a finger across her throat, followed by a hand over her mouth. "They saw her," the translator breathed, the words barely audible. A metal pipe clattered when she tried to crawl away. The man in the blue jacket drew his gun, but the leader stopped him. He said a mute girl was the perfect witness because she could never tell a soul what she heard. They let her run, thinking she was a ghost who couldn't speak. Min-jae looked at Era, whose small body was now shaking with the release of the secret. She had carried the weight of a coup in her silent world, a witness the devils had dismissed as powerless. He realized then that the snake wasn't just behind him in the plaza, it was coiled in the heart of his home. The playground was no longer a place of innocence, it was the site where his empire had been sold, and this little girl was the only one brave enough to sign the truth in a world of liars. The warehouse fell into a profound, ringing silence as the revelation of the betrayal settled. Min-jae leaned back against the cold concrete wall, his mind racing through 2 decades of shared history with the man with the red ring. He was a man who understood greed, power, and revenge, but he could not fathom the logic of the child sitting before him. "Ask her," Min-jae said, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "Ask her why she did it. She knew they were killers. She knew they saw her. Why didn't she just keep running? Why come to me?" The translator relayed the question with soft, hesitant gestures. Era looked down at her worn sneakers, her small shoulders rising and falling in a deep breath. Then, her hands began to move. It wasn't the frantic, jagged signing of a witness in fear, these movements were slow, rhythmic, and strangely tender. The translator blinked, a look of sudden realization softening her face. "She says, she remembers the rain. 2 months ago, at the bus stop near the market. It was a storm, the kind that hurts." She was shivering, trying to protect her sketchbook under her shirt. Min-jae frowned, searching his memory. He lived a life of calculated movements, he didn't visit markets. But then, a flash of gray light returned to him, a day when his car had broken down in a crowded district. He remembered the annoyance, the mud on his expensive shoes, and the sight of a tiny girl huddled under a leaking plastic awning. "She says a big man in a black suit walked past," the translator continued, her voice catching. "He didn't look at her. He didn't even stop walking. But as he passed, he reached out and shoved a heavy, black umbrella into her hands. He didn't stay to be thanked. He just kept walking into the rain, letting himself get soaked so she could stay dry." Era looked up then, meeting Min-jae's intense gaze. She raised her hand and made a simple sign, a fist over her heart, then an open palm toward him. "She says you were the first person who ever saw her without her having to make a sound," the translator whispered. "She saved you because you gave her the only thing she had to keep her safe that day. She says a man who gives his umbrella to a stranger isn't a ghost. He's a person." Min-jae felt a strange, uncomfortable heat behind his eyes. He had spent millions on loyalties that turned out to be hollow, yet he had bought his life with a forgotten umbrella and a 5-minute walk in the rain. For the first time in his life, the ghost of soul felt the weight of his own soul, and it was far heavier than he ever imagined. The moment of reflection was shattered by the high-pitched scream of tires on wet pavement. Outside the warehouse, the roar of a high-performance engine announced that the background man had found them. Min-jae didn't need to see the blue jacket to know the snake had followed the trail. "Get in the car," he roared, grabbing Era by the waist and shielding her with his own body as the first spray of gunfire shredded the warehouse's rusted metal siding. The armored sedan lurched out of the docks, the engine howling as Min-jae took the wheel himself. In the rearview mirror, 2 black SUVs surged through the darkness, their headlights cutting through the rain like the eyes of hungry predators. The background man was visible in the lead vehicle, leaning out of the window with cold, focused intent. He wasn't just shooting at the tires, he was aiming for the passenger side, where Era sat huddled on the floorboards, her small hands covering her ears in a silence that was now filled with the percussion of war. Min-jae floored the accelerator, the city of Seoul blurring into a smear of neon and shadow. He had a dozen escape routes memorized, paths that would lead him to his loyalists and safety, but they all required high-speed maneuvers that would leave the car, and Era, exposed to lethal crossfire. For the first time in his career, the ghost of Seoul didn't choose the most tactical route. He chose the one that kept the armored trunk between the bullets and the child. "Stay down," he gritted out, swerving violently to ram a chasing vehicle into a concrete pillar. The impact jarred his teeth, but he didn't let up. He could have bailed out at the river crossing, disappearing into the dark water where his men were waiting, but that would mean leaving Era in the wreckage. Instead, he steered the heavy car into a narrow, congested alleyway, intentionally scraping the sides to create a bottleneck that the SUVs couldn't breach. As they burst out onto the main bridge, Min-jae realized his own side was bleeding. A stray shard of glass or a graze had opened a wound in his shoulder, but he didn't feel it. His only focus was the small girl on the floor. He had always fought to survive, to keep his throne, to stay a ghost. But as he pushed the car to its breaking point, weaving through traffic to keep her out of the line of sight, he realized he wasn't running to save his life. He was running to save hers. The man who never looked back was now obsessed with the one person who had looked at him and seen a human being. The car glided to a halt in a crumbling neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, a place where the streetlights hummed with a dying buzz and the air tasted of coal dust. Min-jae stepped out, his hand instinctively reaching back to usher Era forward. She led him toward a cramped, low-rise apartment building, her small feet moving with a frantic energy that suggested she already sensed the tragedy waiting for them. They reached the third floor, but the door to Unit 304 didn't need to be opened, it was already hanging off its hinges, the wood splintered by a heavy boot. Min-jae drew his weapon, his eyes scanning the narrow hallway before he stepped inside. The apartment was a wreckage of a life once carefully lived. A small wooden table was overturned, chairs were smashed into kindling, and Era's colorful drawings were scattered across the floor, trampled by muddy footprints. Era let out a soft, choked gasp, the only sound he had ever heard her make. She ran toward the back bedroom, her hands flying to her mouth. Min-jae followed, his heart hardening into a block of ice. The room was empty. There was no sign of her mother, only a discarded cell phone crushed on the floor and a wall where family photos had been ripped down. On the center of the bed lay a single, terrifying message. A red silk handkerchief, the signature of the man with the red ring. Min-jae knelt and picked up a small, framed photo from the debris. It showed Era and a weary-looking woman laughing under a bright yellow umbrella, his umbrella. He looked at the girl, who was now frantically signing to the empty air, her hands moving in a blur of, where, and, mama. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Era wasn't just a witness they had dismissed, she was a target they were using to draw him out. They hadn't just trashed a home, they had erased her world to ensure she had nowhere to run but to him. He looked at the discarded sketchbook on the floor, seeing a drawing of a large, shadowy man holding an umbrella over a tiny girl. They took her to make you speak, Min-jae whispered, his voice thick with a cold, simmering rage. He realized then that Era had no one left in the world but the ghost she had saved. She was truly alone, caught in the jaws of a beast he had helped create. He reached out and placed a hand on her trembling shoulder, his gaze fixing on the red handkerchief. The gang wasn't just hunting a family, they were hunting his soul, and for the first time, Min-jae decided that the silence of soul was finally going to end in fire. Min-jae stood in the center of a dimly lit shipping container, surrounded by the few men whose loyalty hadn't been bought with ruby rings. The air was thick with the scent of gun oil and cold sweat. Usually, Min-jae issued orders in a voice that brooked no question, but tonight, he stood back. Beside him, Era stood on a wooden crate, her small face set in a mask of grim determination that mirrored his own. The traders are monitoring our frequencies, Min-jae said to his men, his eyes scanning their rugged faces. They expect us to speak. They expect us to move like a gang. But tonight, we move in the one language they dismissed as a weakness. He nodded to Era. With the translator standing by to ensure precision, the little girl began to teach the elite soldiers the signs for ambush, betrayal, and shield. The hardened men, many of whom had never looked a child in the eye, watched her fingers with intense focus. To any observer, it looked like a dance, but to Min-jae, it was the construction of a ghost army. Era signed the gesture for snake, and then pointed toward the northern warehouse district where her mother was being held. The soldiers mimicked the sign, their hands moving in silent unison. They wouldn't use radios that could be intercepted or shouts that would give away their positions. They would communicate through the very silence Era lived in every day. If they see you speaking, they'll know you're coming, Min Jae told his lieutenants. But they won't look at your hands. They think a mute girl's language is a game. We're going to show them it's a death sentence. As the men fanned out into the night, disappearing into the shadows of Seoul, they didn't speak a word. In the back of the lead SUV, Min Jae watched Era. She was still signing, practicing the gestures for safe and home over and over. He realized that he wasn't just using her language to win a war, he was finally entering her world. The language of war was no longer about the loud bang of a gun or the roar of an engine. It was the silent, invisible thread of a child's courage, weaving through the dark streets, leading them straight into the heart of the betrayal. The ghost was no longer haunting the city, he was being guided by a light that didn't need a voice to shine. The warehouse at the edge of the Han River was a tomb of rusted steel and freezing shadows. Inside, the man with the red ring stood over Era's mother, his weapon drawn, his face twisted in a smirk of unearned victory. He expected the roar of engines, he expected the shout of Min Jae's ego. Instead, the darkness around him remained unnervingly, impossibly still. One by one, the mole's sentries were neutralized without a single cry. Min Jae's men flowed through the rafters and behind crates, communicating with the swift, silent flicks of their wrists, the language Era had taught them. By the time the traitor realized his perimeter was gone, Min Jae was already standing 10 feet away, his silhouette carved out of the gloom. "You're alone, Hyung," Min Jae said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. The mole laughed, though his hand trembled as he pressed the gun to the woman's temple. "You think you've won because you snuck in? I have the city's police in my pocket and your accounts drained. I have the noise of the world on my side. What do you have? A child who can't even scream." Min Jae stepped into the light. Behind him, Era emerged, her small face set with a chilling resolve. She didn't hide. She looked directly at the man who had betrayed her savior and raised her hands. In the absolute silence of the warehouse, her fingers moved with the force of a thunderclap. Traitor. Coward. Snake. Min Jae didn't look away from the mole's eyes. "You underestimated her because you couldn't hear her. But she told me everything you whispered in the dark. She gave me the truth while you gave me lies." The traitor began to babble, a frantic torrent of threats and excuses, but the louder he spoke, the smaller he seemed. Min Jae moved with a predatory grace, disarming the man with a strike so fast it looked like a blur. He didn't use his gun. He leaned in close, his shadow engulfing the trembling mole. "Listen to that sound," Min Jae hissed, gesturing to the silence Era stood in. "That is the sound of your empire falling. Her silence is louder than any threat you ever made. It's the last thing you're ever going to hear." With a final, decisive movement, Min Jae ensured the betrayal would never breathe again. He didn't look back at the fallen man. He turned his back on the violence and walked toward Era, who was already running into her mother's arms. The ghost of Seoul had finally found a voice that mattered, and it was one that didn't need to make a sound to bring a kingdom to its knees. 6 months had passed, and the city of Seoul remained under the watchful eye of the man they still called the Ghost. To the outside world, Kang Min Jae was as formidable as ever, his empire was stabilized, the traitors had been scrubbed from the streets, and his power was absolute. But those within his inner circle noticed a profound change in the atmosphere of his headquarters. The suffocating tension had been replaced by a purposeful, protective calm. The shadow was no longer hiding from the world, he was guarding it. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Min-jae's motorcade pulled up to the same Han River Park where a coup had once been plotted in the dark. This time, there were no assassins lurking in construction zones. His men took their positions at the perimeter, but they didn't stand with hands on holstered weapons. Instead, they stood with their hands clasped in front of them, watching with subtle smiles as their boss stepped out of the lead car. Min-jae walked toward a bright yellow bench where Yoon-era sat waiting, swinging her legs and looking at a brand new sketchbook. Beside her, her mother sat peacefully, watching the river. As Min-jae approached, he didn't wait for a bow or a report. He shed the weight of his tailored suit jacket, tossing it onto the bench, and did something that would have once been unthinkable. The most powerful man in the city's underworld dropped to his knees in the grass, crouching at the level of a 7-year-old girl. Era looked up, her eyes sparkling with joy, and immediately raised her hands. She moved them slowly, guiding him. Min-jae watched her intently, his brow furrowed in deep concentration, the same focus he used to dismantle rival syndicates. He raised his large, scarred hands, carefully mimicking her motions. He fumbled a gesture, and Era let out a silent, bright laugh, reaching out to adjust the position of his fingers with her tiny hands. He tried again, his movements becoming more fluid. He signed, "Thank you for the light." Era beamed and signed back, "You are my hero." Min-jae looked out over the river, the golden hour sun reflecting off the water. He was still a man of shadows, and he knew the world he occupied would always be dangerous. But as he turned back to Era, learning the sign for family, he realized he was no longer a ghost haunting a city of silence. He had found a voice in the one place he never thought to look, and for the first time in his life, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything worth protecting. The shadow had finally found his light, and it was shining brighter than the neon heart of Seoul.